Hey coders, welcome to the React Native section part of the course. The funny part about this is actually a reshoot of the React Native videos, as the previous ones that were recorded about a year ago, if not less, are already in need of update. That's one of the fun sides of working with really new technologies like React Native, is that they will have major version releases and changes that could break everything that you've been coding to that point in time. Always fun, am I right? So these videos are reshoots to keep up and updated with the modern React Native layout. So let's go ahead and dive on in and start discussing what's going on. What is React Native? It will appear very similar to React, but it's not. One of the phrases that my students can probably repeat after I've said it so many times to them in webinars is it's same, but different. You're going to be coding in React-style components, but the code you're going to be using won't be actual HTML-based components. They will be using React Native components, which will make more sense once we actually dive on into our first project together. As I was saying, it takes all the normal React things you code, and instead it will create them into an iOS and an Android project that you can actually be loading onto simulators and deploying to the stores. It will not use HTML and CSS. However, it uses a syntax that looks very, very similar, and that will instead be being translated to actual native components on a device, meaning it will use something that looks like, and again, HTML components that you might build in React, and it might be using some kind of style sheet with similar looking properties, but at the end of the day, it's not the same thing. So again, same, but different. Keep that in mind as you're moving forward. You're not actually building any kind of hybrid apps using React Native. You're building true native code, which is awesome, because there's some instances in other frameworks and libraries that will actually be building a pseudo web page that your app will just show. So we're not making those hybrid web page apps that feel and look like an actual native app, but we're building a true native application for your device. And the unfortunate side of things is our React components that we may have made in the curriculum up to this point can't really be shared, since they all are built on HTML elements. You might be able to use some kind of logic in your component did mounts where it comes to like fetch calls and things like that, but there are other things that will not translate whatsoever. And we'll figure those out as we progress through the curriculum. So styling React Native has a few options. So first off, let's start out by saying it does use something called style sheets that's based in the React Native component library, but it's actually not like cascading style sheets. You can't use a CSS framework like Bootstrap, which is very unfortunate for us design challenged individuals like myself. It uses instead something like a style sheet object that has nested objects within that is rendered in that component only. So only that component will have access to its own style sheet object. If you've used styled components in the React section of the course, if you discovered it and tried using it, you'll find yourself actually using familiar syntax from there. And again, it can be a little bit confusing for especially new student web developers coming into React Native, because it looks so incredibly similar, but again, it's not. So you're going to find that some CSS properties work and others don't. You're going to be using a lot of flex and justify content, align items. You still have things like font size and color and whatnot, but you'll find that there are some unique properties that are shared between both and some that are just only in the React Native library. And again, Google and the React Native documentation will be your best friend for finding out what you're missing. And the error handling on some of these is actually on how to build React Native apps is pretty good, and they'll have a list of like, hey, you're trying to use X property that doesn't exist. Might I suggest some of these similar ones that you're trying to be, or maybe looking for, or trying to use. Outside of writing raw style sheets, you can also use third-party UI frameworks, which is also a lot of fun. Recently, there have been some issues with these larger UI frameworks causing slowdowns, but in our basic apps, it won't really be an issue, where we can just pull what components we need and build a quick and good-looking app fairly quickly. There are two very popular ones right now called React Native Elements and Native Base. If you Google either of these guys, you'll go to their websites and check out the documentation. It's essentially like installing a Node NPM module with a couple extra steps sometimes when it comes to linking certain things. And it allows you to import components that are built on the native React Native components. So they're built on top of the React Native components like style sheet, view, and text, and they add extra features, attributes, and props you could pass, like, hey, I want this guy to have a thick border with a small bit of shadow. It's going to be a card type component, so you'll be using these guys to make your apps look nice and styled fairly quickly out of the box. So how do we actually create React Native apps? There's a couple different ways. We'll be covering the two major ways here in this little demo. The first one, and one of the easiest ones to get up and running with, is the Expo CLI. Now, for you old school React Native people like myself, aka not even a year ago when I learned how to code in React Native, you might be familiar with Create React Native App, or CRNA. That's an old way of getting a React Native app up and running fairly quickly. It was built using Expo, and they ended up merging to become one thing. Expo has absorbed Create React Native App. So if you're familiar with that, go ahead and toss that out the window, and what you're going to want to do instead is head to the Expo website and install the CLI globally. So an npm install-g Expo CLI, which we'll be covering in the next video anyway, if you don't want to remember it for now. The cool thing about Expo is that it's a fantastic and fun and easy way to go ahead and run apps on your physical device, or even a simulator if you wanted to. Now, it doesn't actually deploy your code anywhere. It just gives you typically a QR code or some kind of web link that you can load in the Expo app on your phone, and it loads your code onto your phone, and you get to play with it and do your swipe tests, scroll around, see how your native code does. So like I was saying, it spins up a local web server and it connects it via the Expo app on your device. So you install Expo CLI on your computer, you initialize a new Expo app, you cd into that project directory, and then you type in some code and run, believe it or not, just npm start. It builds up a bundler that will serve your code on the web server that will allow you to connect. So then you download your Expo client app on your physical device from the Google Play Store or the iOS Store, and then all you have to do is just connect to it and you're about good to go, which we'll be covering in the next video. The downside, however, is you can't deploy it directly to either of the stores. You'll have to eject out of this first. Because we're having to essentially put this together on the Expo API, you're not actually writing a lot of native code in your project. You're just building it on the basic React Native components, along with the Expo API and what it provides. So if you want to write true custom native code, if you need something that you really need to code on this device, more than likely you're going to have to eject out of the Expo environment first before you can actually code your custom native component. The second big and easy way to get up and running with one of these projects is our React Native CLI. This one, for iOS users, you will not be able to run on a physical device. You'll have to go through the Apple Test Flight program in order to do that. But if you're an Android user, you can actually connect your Android device via USB to your computer and be able to run the React Native CLI. And the difference here is, again, I'd mentioned that you built on top of the Expo API and the React Native vanilla components, but React Native CLI builds true native code. So the second you do a React Native init in a new project, believe it or not, you can deploy that directly to either of the stores right away. And the React Native CLI will also have an additional requirement if you want, you can also do this on Expo, but for React Native CLI, it's a requirement. You have to have Xcode on your Mac installed or Android Studio on Windows, and it's also available on Mac and Linux, I believe. So Xcode will allow us to run an iOS simulator on our Macs, but we don't have that option on Windows. So if you're a Windows user like myself, you either have to go get somebody's Mac and code on it, or hope that your Android code is also looking fairly good on an iOS device. Mac can do, however, both iOS and Androids, and Windows can only do Android simulators. Yeah, so moving down now, some basic required setup to get this stuff up and running. We're going to need React in all these projects, obviously, since it's built on it. And it's been essentially the same as you've been doing. Nothing new to really worry about there. The general flow of information is still going to work the same way with state and props and things like that. We're also going to be using the React Native library now instead of React DOM to interact with our devices. So it's actually going to be pulling in native components instead of browser components, and that's awesome. And the Facebook page for React Native has some excellent documentation on all the vanilla components it provides, their props and things they can do for you and how to use them. So while you might have if you want to display even a basic hello world header in HTML, CSS, and React and things like that, you would use probably a div to wrap it and style that div somehow with CSS, and you might have an H1 that says simply hello world. Instead of a div, you use something called a view in React Native. Instead of a H1, you have something called a text that you have to style to a certain size. And after all that, you're still coding components in the same way. You're going to be having stateless functional components if you have like a dummy component that just has to display some information, doesn't really care about state or interacting with things. You can still use the class components that extend the React component class, and they have access to all their same component lifecycle methods of did mount, will mount, and things like that. And as of recently, they come with options to have a lot of easy TypeScript support. So at the end of the day, we just got to be ready to jump on in and figure it out, as that's the best way to figure out a lot of these frameworks is, ignore the documentation and mess around with it for several hours until you get something going like true developers do. So stay tuned for the next video. We're going to dive in on Expo CLI and how to get our first basic app running. See you then.